Tonight we're going to look at lessons 17 and 18, the new woman and Phoebe's place. And I think you'll find some interesting comments, and I'm going to add some of mine at the closer of the lesson. The question, shall the sisters pray and speak in public? I think sometimes we have to define terminology and also describe what we consider as public. I think generally what is usually meant by this is in the public assembly, when we have come together as the church. Not in the ladies' class, not in which is actually out in public and is open to anyone that would like to come. So sometimes we have to be very careful how that we look at a statement and also how that we interpret a statement too. This was one of the most pressing questions among churches of Christ from about 1888 and for several more years after that. And it kind of pulses through the church every once in a while. I think two of the big fights that are coming for the church in the next few years, this is one of them. The acceptance and the use of women in the public worship, and also that of the acceptability of homosexuals. Those are going to be two biggies that we're going to have to fight. We've been very fortunate that we haven't gotten into those fights just yet, but they're coming, and it's going to happen. So regardless of whatever the questions that arise, there are seasons of times in which the church must deal with these different issues. In March of 1888, a man wrote to David Lipscomb, who's editor of the Gospel Advocate, and suggested that the command found in 1 Corinthians 14:34, let your women keep silence in the churches, prohibited women even from teaching children in the Sunday school. Now this basic concept and idea of women teaching in the Sunday school has evolved in some places into some what are oftentimes identified as anti-groups, in which they have taken this position, but they're also inconsistent. If you take this statement, let your women keep silent in the churches, as being as a total, unequivocal, unmovable command, then you ladies can't sing. And I'll tell you what, the singing will be terrible. I know. I preached a sermon one time in a place in which there were not a whole lot of men in the congregation. And almost every woman in the congregation sang alto and off key together. And the singing was very interesting. I have to put it that way. I've never been any place where it was like that. If this was true, a woman could never ask a question in the public assemblies. You'd either have to wait, and the technicality of all of these would be, if we've dismissed, then you can ask the question. Or if you're outside the church building, you can ask the question. So what does he mean by let your women keep silence in the churches? And we're going to deal with this a little bit as we go through this lesson this evening. It is not a total silence to the point in which that you cannot speak. If so, when we have assembled together, you couldn't greet anybody, you couldn't talk to them, you would have to be mute the whole time that you were present at the assembly itself. So be careful of the position that you take and how that you interpret this. David Lipscomb responded to this basic concept by saying that women could teach children and even their husbands, but only in a modest, differential manner. Now, I told you have to be careful about defining terms. I have no idea what that means. If you do, I would appreciate it if you would share that with me. In a modest, differential manner, I guess. Basically, he means not in an assuming, authoritative way. Not in the same tone that the wife would say, take out the garbage. Women must never stand before promiscuous or mixed assemblies, but rather teach only in private. I don't think I've ever been at a promiscuous assembly before. I don't know what he meant by that, except this was the usage of a term that certainly today has a very different term, or at least different meaning than it did back in the day in which he wrote this. The point of our lesson this evening is a woman by the name of Selina Moore Holman. And this is interesting. I'll make a comment here in just a minute, but I will give you some information about her. She was an elder's wife from Fayetteville, Tennessee, and challenged some of the traditional assumptions, provoking sharp and lively exchanges with Lipscomb that continued on and off for many years. Now, I preached for 6 years just outside of Fayetteville, Tennessee, a little place called Parks City, and it was between Fayetteville and the Alabama line. There were actually 4 congregations between Fayetteville and the Alabama line. One was called State Line Church. There were 2 on the east and the west of where we sat at Parks City, and all of these were south of Fayetteville, Tennessee. What was interesting during that 6 years that I was there, and I don't remember the preacher's name at the Fayetteville congregation. He was an older gentleman. He was considerably older than I was. And during that period of time, in all of our conversations, never heard her name come up. I don't know if it was the way that the things had changed, but you have to realize when she died in 1915 that that's been more than 100 years ago. Now, if you go back more than 100 years prior to this congregation, this building didn't exist. What was it, 2 years ago we celebrated our 70th anniversary for this congregation, and yet when you remember that Oak Ridge is less than 75 years, it was just now being 75 years old, you go back 100 years and you're back into the situation where we've got 6 small farming communities that are here, and there were no churches of Christ in this general area right here. So things change, people change, congregations change as we cycle through life itself. None of us are the same as we were 25 years ago. I don't know if you would want to be. Somebody the other day at the food pantry over there was talking about watching the kids out on the playground. Said, "Oh, I wish I had that much energy." I said, "No, you don't. It'd kill you in 2 minutes. At your age, you couldn't stand it." So things do change. Concepts change. Preaching changes. And, you know, I appreciated what Brother Ray Smith told me the last Sunday that I preached here. He said one of the teenagers had talked to him. And he said, when Brother Wallace got up to preach, he said, "Oh no," he says, "that's one of those old-time Church of Christ preachers." And he said the next thing he knew, we was offering the invitation. He said he sat there and enthralled the whole time with what was being said. And he said, "Well, he wasn't anything like what I thought he was going to be." I always took that as a compliment wherever I preached, when people in the community would say, "You're not like the other Church of Christ preachers that I've ever known." And I always thought, okay, I'm making some insides to people that are here. So we asked the question then, who was Selina Moore Holman? She was born on July the 9th in 1850 near Lynchburg, Tennessee. I do not know if her family was the family for which Moore County was named. Moore County is still the smallest county in the state of Tennessee. It is still one of the least populated counties in the state of Tennessee also. She died September the 18th in 1915, saying that she had lived to be 65 years old. Now, that was old back then. She married Dr. T.P. Holman in January of 1875, and they had 8 children together. And it was her father, who was Captain J.L. Moore, a Confederate Army officer who had died from battle wounds when she was only 14 years old. And what kind of interesting was that she took it upon herself to take care of her brother and sisters, and she went to work as a school teacher and in order to help with the financial situation with her family. Who was Selena Moore Holman? As the oldest child, she took on the responsibility of caring for her sisters and her brother by earning her a living as a teacher. She met her husband when he treated her for a severe illness in 1874, and they married just a year later than that. Also, we find out that she was a very strong supporter of the temperance movement and active in the movement to gain women's right to vote. Today, we would label her as an activist. I don't know if that's a good terminology or not, but she was a person that was very much interested in the progression of the position of women in society itself. She was the president of the Tennessee Women's Christian Temperance Union for 15 years. Later on, this was changed to be called the United Temperance Union, and I think that's still the name of it today. I'm not exactly positive. I had some connection with that some years ago when we fought the putting in of liquor in Sevier County, and I got a lot of information from them, and they were excited to find out where we stood with all of this. Who was Selena Moore Holman? She wrote articles for the Gospel Advocate, and her first article appeared in February of 1888. It was entitled, "Shall the Church Help the Saloon to Live?" It's kind of interesting, but it was simply because she was opposed to intoxicating beverages of any kind, and that if preachers didn't preach against it and Christians didn't imbibe, then they were actually supporting the saloons. Again, you have to be kind of careful where you tag on to terminology. This title is a long title, and I don't know. Back in those days, it probably would have gotten a lot of people to read it. The article that she wrote encouraged church members to make non-intoxicating drinks for refreshment and even included her own recipe. I don't know what it was. I didn't look it up, didn't try to find out what it was. I'm not really interested in it because probably a lot of the stuff that she would have put in it we don't have available to us today. But there was no alcohol in it. In 1888, she wrote a letter to the Gospel Advocate taking a different stance from David Lipscomb's stand about women in the church. And her position was bantered back and forth with Lipscomb and also Sewell for a number of years. She believed husbands are the head of the household and the wife's first role is to support the family, but she also believed there was no reason to prevent women from teaching on biblical topics, and to support her claims, she pointed to examples of women in the Bible who were placed in positions of power by God. Kind of interesting in this, most of the arguments that many people have used for women having an open position and serving in an open position in the assembly take examples from the Old Testament. And we have to be very careful about that because what those examples deal with was a different day and a time and system that God had set up under Judaism that doesn't apply to Christianity. Now, there are some things that are very general that can also be applied to us in our day and time. In the 1890s, she aligned herself with the New Woman movement, which supported the women's suffrage, supported better education for women, and more opportunities for church leadership. You have to remember at the time that this took place, there were not very many women involved in higher education. If a woman had a high school diploma, that was very unusual. It was kind of unusual for a lot of boys to get one too. Many of them dropped out along about the 6th and 8th grades in order to go to work with their dads on the farm. But we also remember that under the Jewish system, girls were not educated, period. They stayed in the home. Their mothers taught them how to sew, to cook, to keep the house, to do whatever needed, and take care of the younger children and whatever was necessary to keep a household going. And that was the position of women back in those days. And in some places, women were only considered as the private property of the man, and that has changed considerably. And fortunately, I think today we see a lot of difference between the concepts that were happening during Mrs. Holman's day and time and today. Here's a comment that she made in 1888. A learned Christian woman may expound the scriptures and urge obedience to them to 100 men and women at one time, as well as to 100 one at a time, and no more violate a scriptural command in one instance than in the other. Again, it's kind of a broad statement. It's probably very true. I've known of certain circumstances in some places where the church is very small, in which there were no men that were present, or that the men that were present were not members of the church. Now, how do you deal with that? My personal view on that is that you deal with it when you're there. You don't have to deal with it, or you don't have to make judgments. You don't have to make the call. You don't have to make the rules and regulations if you're not there. What they do is their business. What we do is our business. And so that sometimes is very hard for us to do, because we're of a kind of people that oftentimes like to run other people's business. And we like to tell them what they need to do, and we don't like to be told what to do. This is the house that they lived in Fayetteville, Tennessee. I know where this house was. I've seen it many times. It had fallen into great disrepair, and I think that it has been taken over by some beneficent group that has rebuilt and refurbished and replenished the house and brought it back, because it was one of the older homes that was in Fayetteville, Tennessee. It was a beautiful old home, and this is evidently her family. This woman that is sitting right here is Selena Moore Holman. Here's another picture that I pulled out of an older gospel advocate with his David Lipscomb's picture on it, so that you won't forget who he looked like, even though you've never met him, and you will never meet him, I don't guess, for a long time. Here's another homebody picture. I do not know who all these people are. I assume, since this was found under the heading of Selena Moore Holman, that this is Selena here, and that this is the good doctor over here on this side over here. Simply because they're about the same age, and they're both sitting down, and everybody is being nice to them. They're waiting for their inheritance. Here's the tombstone where Selena is buried in Fayetteville, showing that she was the president of the Tennessee Women's Christian Temperance Union from 1899 to 1950, until the time she died, really. So you don't have to worry about her sneaking up on you. Now, let's talk about some of the arguments that were made by Mrs. Holman on her beliefs. One, she said that there were several passages indicating that women were prominent workers in the early church. I have no argument with this. It's very obvious that this took place. The women that traveled with Jesus, the home of Mary and Martha was evidently a place that Jesus went to very often. And anytime that he went to the city of Jerusalem, he went to Bethany, and that's where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. 2 sisters and a brother. We know nothing of their parentage, but we do know that they were evidently close supporters of Jesus and his work. She also indicated that there were other passages seeming to teach differently from 1 Corinthians 14 and 34, which says, let women keep silent in the church. We've made mention of that a little bit earlier, the fact that it cannot necessarily be a very specific and a very demanding position to be taken. There had to be a circumstance under which that was to be expressed. She also cited Deborah, the judge of Israel, in Judges 4, 5, and 6. She would cite Anna the prophetess in Luke, the 2nd chapter, and this was the woman that when Mary and Jesus went to the temple for the purification rites, that Anna came in and met and got to hold the baby and prophesied about him. She also cited Priscilla, who taught Apollos, which is kind of interesting because the scripture says that Priscilla and her husband taught Apollos together. Doesn't say that she did this specifically. So there was a combination of work that took place in that. She also cited Philip's 4 daughters who prophesied in Acts 21, verses 8 and verse 9. Now, your book says Philip's 4 daughters who preached alongside of him. Now, the scripture doesn't say that. So you got to be very careful in what you read in the commentary, and our book is a commentary on what this fellow, Leonard Allen, thought took place in the script in the church in those days and times. Here's some more arguments that were made by Mrs. Holman on her beliefs. She rejected the distinction between private and public spheres that Lipscomb and others sought to maintain. Lipscomb's position was that a woman had no right to speak openly in the public assembly. But if you got outside, you could talk and you could say, and if you were in a small group someplace, then that was different than what the public assembly. The public assembly, I think we have been very much like our religious neighbors. We have tried to make this a sacred place, and we have made this a sacred assembly of some kind, and certainly it is because God's here and Christ is here. But to make a difference because of being in the church building is something that was a big argument back in her day and time. But you have to remember that a lot of smaller groups didn't have church buildings. They couldn't afford them, and so they met in people's homes. Such distinction, she argued, was much more cultural than it was scriptural. And her argument there is probably right to a certain degree. She rejected Lipscomb's position that God had made women more emotional and less rational than man. Oh, I don't know. You go to a UT football game on Saturday and watch the guys jump up and down when Tennessee scores or when they fumble. And they get pretty emotional, don't they? Well, sometimes it's more fun to watch the people than it is to watch the ball game. In fact, the last couple of years, it's been better to watch the crowd than it was to watch the players on the field. She also rejected Lipscomb's position that women were suited for nurturing children, but not for public teaching or leadership. Now, you also have to remember that this was in the day and time in which women did not have the vote, and most women did not venture very far out of the home. There were very few people that were in public business anywhere, and so things have changed quite considerably. World War I and World War II changed that so considerably when all the men went off to war, and if anything had to be run, the women had to do it. Now, here's some of Lipscomb's position on women and their work in the church. And then you can see why that there was a contention back and forth between she and Brother Lipscomb. He says in the story of Adam and Eve, Lipscomb asserted that the Holy Spirit was saying, quote, I suffered you to take the lead once. Your strong emotional nature led you to violate God's word and to shipwreck a world I cannot trust you to lead. Now, I have looked very carefully, and the only place that I've ever found that statement is in the Book of Opinions. Now, a lot of things come from the Book of Opinions. The Book of Opinions is pretty thick. And so I made a comment about this, and I said, this appears to me that Lipscomb was putting words into the mouth of the Holy Spirit, which was a very dangerous position to take or to stand upon, when in truth, this statement was never said in any place of the Scriptures. So we have to be careful what we say, and we have to be careful on what we stand in order to take a position about anything. Here's some more of Lipscomb's positions. He revealed clearly his deep allegiance to what historians of the period have called the cult of true womanhood, or the cult of domesticity. And this version of the ideal woman emerged in America between 1820 and 1860 and remained dominant until near the end of the century. Now, about the turn of the century is when the movement for women to gain the right to vote took place. And it did not come overnight, and it was not an easy struggle. Women may be a little more easier upon the subject than men are, but I've found that men sometimes are so hard-headed that you can't reason with them on a lot of things. And that was one of them. And again, this goes back to the concept that the world was evolving out of women being the personal property of a man. In fact, many people in this day and time, women got married, and that was their occupation, marriage. Not out in the field, not in the cities, not in the businesses, and businesses were predominantly run and operated by men and owned by men. Lipscomb and Sewall, who was one of the associate editor of the Gospel Advocate and a gospel preacher, and most other leaders condemned the strong-minded women who sought the right to vote. Sewall wrote, a principle which, if allowed to spread, threatens to destroy the most sacred of all institutions, and I've inserted the home, is what he meant, and make America a homeless nation. These guys would have fit right in with President Trump and tweeting today. This was tweeting before there was anything to tweet on. And this was a weekly magazine that came to people's homes, and oftentimes they opened it up to find out who was fighting who. And that was what oftentimes helped sell the magazine, The Gospel Advocate. Now here's a synopsis of things that I came together looking at all these pages that we have on Mrs. Holman. She did not hold a specific position in the local church at Fayetteville, Tennessee. She was not a deaconess at that congregation. Her husband was one of the elders of that congregation. But she did not hold a specific position in the local church. However, she was a very staunch worker for the local congregation. She diligently served in ways that definitely benefited the work of the local church. She was a very outspoken woman who did take on many of the masculine put-downs of the modern woman or the new woman. And I think this is where most of the contention really was, that she challenged men on their level of thinking, and they didn't like it. And so they were determined not to go in that direction. She was a proponent of women's rights, the right to vote, and she was very opposed to the use of liquor in any form. And later she served as president of the Tennessee Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, for right now, that's all I'm going to say about Mrs. Holman, because I've got a lot of other things I want to say and want to be sure that I have time to get to the end of to the summing up of everything that I want to look at tonight. Now, our second lesson, coming from chapter 18, is entitled Phoebe's Place. Moses E. Lard, who was a preacher in the Christian church, and generally in the north, around Cincinnati and that general area, and Indianapolis, Phoebe was said, quote, Phoebe was a deaconess in the official sense of that word whenever the necessities of the churches are such as to demand it. The order of deaconesses should be reestablished. Now, if anybody made that kind of statement today, very quickly, I think that person would be labeled as a troublemaker. Because this is not a common thing that is done in our churches in this day and time. And we also, again, have to remember that what goes on in another congregation does not set precedents for what we do. Unfortunately, sometimes we begin to follow what other people are doing rather than to making our own way, which we should actually do. Here's a picture of Alexander Campbell. I found a good colored picture of a portrait of him. Very staunch-looking man. Reminds me of Henry Clay. And he and Henry Clay were good friends, by the way. Campbell also dictated, or at least preached about, the ancient order. And the ancient order usually meant to him the New Testament church of the first century. To him, there had to be a plurality of elders and deacons in each congregation. I don't think we have any problems with that in our day and time. Included among the deacons, though, were female deacons, in his opinion. In 1827, Campbell wrote that early Christians in Jerusalem appointed female deacons or deaconesses to visit and to wait upon the sisters. Now, I don't know where he got that. I think he got that in the same place of the other passage that we talked about a while ago. I think that came from the Book of Opinions. And even though as scholarly a man as Campbell was, this is one of those areas that was one of the props that he used in teaching other individuals. And it's kind of interesting. He would say, of this sort was Phoebe of Cenchrea and other persons mentioned in the New Testament who labored in the gospel. It's kind of interesting that no other woman in the New Testament was called a deacon or deaconess other than Phoebe. Here's some more of Campbell's views. From Romans 16:1 and 1 Timothy 3:11, he wrote in 1835, it appears that females were constituted deaconesses in the primitive church. Duties to females as well to males demand this. Again, where is this found? We're going to talk about this word deacon in just a moment. Since these specially appointed women comprised part of the church's ancient order, it followed that they should have a place in the restored church. However, Campbell apparently did not crusade for the appointment of deaconesses, but his views had considerable impact. He did not go about saying, you've got to appoint women deacons in congregation in order to be a scripturally organized congregation. He did not do that. What he believed and what he taught others to believe sometimes was considerably different. Now, let's look at some other people and their positions about women's work in the church. Talbot Fanning said, the sisters beyond all question were as legitimately deacons as the brethren. Now you remember when we talked about David Lipscomb had a lot of problems of saying either elders or deacons were official offices in the church itself. Fanny goes on to say, Paul said, I commend you, Phoebe, our sister, who is a deacon servant of the church at Cenchrea. He said, the apostle not only recommended the brethren at Rome to receive her as a deacon of her church, but to assist her in whatever business that she had need of them. We'll deal with that in just a little bit, and just hang on. The name deacon, he added, comes from the service performed. Philip was called an evangelist because of his labor. Phoebe was called deacon in consequence of her labor in the cause for Christ. W.K. Pendleton, who was the son-in-law of Alexander Campbell and also editor of one of Campbell's papers, wrote in 1848 that it was generally regarded among our brethren as an essential element in the restoration of the primitive order to ordain in every church both deacons and deaconesses. We've got to come back to that word in just a minute. In 1870, he said, besides deacons, every church should have deaconesses whose duty it is to perform such offices as cannot be so well performed by deacons, and especially such to females as could not and I used David Wallace's computer and it misspelled with. That's supposed to be with. Delicacy and propriety to be laid upon the deacons. He makes a very valid point here. There are some things that women can do, especially for women, that men can't do, or really ought not to be doing, in the sake of propriety. Robert Milligan wrote, the diaconate of the primitive church was not confined to male members, he wrote in 1868. He said that deaconesses were also appointed to attend to the wants of the sick and the needy, especially of their own sex. And since the poor and needy will always remain, churches will always require the attention of both deacons and deaconesses, just as much as they did in the churches of Jerusalem, Cenchrea, and Ephesus. What happened in Acts, the 6th chapter? Do you remember? There was a complaint that took place that the Grecian widows were being neglected. Who was appointed to take care of them? Who? Don't make me look out like an owl. Who? 7 men. All right. The Bible scholar has spoken. Were there women appointed to do that? Do you think the men did the cooking? I don't believe the men did the cooking. I believe that most of those men in that day and time didn't know the slightest thing about cooking anything. They were a whole lot like we are today. They'll go out and stick a fire out in the backyard and put something on it and burn it and say, boy, that's good. When it's not usually, sometimes. Sometimes guys are really good at it, aren't they? And women have let us do that. They have patted us on the head and said, honey, that's good. When it probably wouldn't. Okay. These guys, he said, Phoebes should therefore constitute a part of the diaconoi of every fully organized congregation. Moses E. Lard, we come back to him. He's the one who made the statement that we said a while ago. He saw deaconesses as the part of the apostolic order. Did Phoebe belong to an order of official women in the church? She certainly belonged to an order of women called servants of the church, who performed their service by apostolic sanction, and the duties of this order were the same as those usually ascribed to deaconesses. I know of no place that the apostles appointed women to those specific things. There were women that did things. There were women that followed around with Paul. There were women that followed around with Jesus. There were others that were very influential in the congregations where they were, and they did great works. He says that Phoebe was a deaconess in the official sense of that word. As a result, he urged present-day churches should also have them whenever necessary. The order of should be reestablished. E.G. Sewell, gospel preacher, said, women are not official deaconesses any more than men were official deacons. You see, he took the same position that Lipscomb took. He said these are not official things, but these are works that people do within the congregation. Sewell and Lipscomb both rejected all officialism in the church. And I think a lot of that comes from what Protestantism was running away from in Roman Catholicism, that highly structured, organized system in which there was such a hierarchy that it was hard to deal with. To him, both men and women occupied exactly the same role, appointed servants, nothing more. There is absolutely nothing in the use of the Greek word diakoneo, nor in a correct translation of it to justify such an official idea. Sewell was troubled to see a specific class of men in the church called deacons, for he believed that the term should be applied to anyone that serves in any capacity in the church. We'll follow up on that. C.R. Nichol, who was another generation down from all of this, made this comment. He said, it should be known in every congregation, he wrote in 1938, that Sister Phoebe, Sister Priscilla, Sister Dorcas are deaconesses in the congregation, and that when their assistance is needed, they are to be called. Though a few like Nichol spoke out, few congregations seem to have considered appointing women as deacons, and virtually no congregation actually did so. Women, of course, continued to do a great deal of serving in the churches as they always had, and that, after all, was what they took to be Phoebe's place. Now, let's talk about this contested word diakonon, from which we get the word deacon, and I'll show you how we get that in a minute. The word itself, if it is properly translated, is servant. That's what it literally means, a servant. Thus, it brings up the problem of what is called transliteration versus translation. Now, translation is the giving of the meaning of a word from an original language into the current language. For example, from Greek into English. I give you the meaning of that word. And sometimes when you go from one language to another, there is not a word that fits. And so you kind of got to fudge just a little bit in order to let it make sense. Transliteration is taking original language word and making a similar looking and sounding word in the current language. I'm going to show you how this works. The Greek word baptizo, I have anglicized it in the very first one. The second one, it is written in Greek itself. If you take this word and you translate it, it is always translated as immerse. Originally, this was a nautical term. And the nautical term always referred to a ship that was totally sunk and even the mast was not seen sticking out of the water. If the mast was sticking out of the water, you used a different word. Baptizo meant to be plunged under or into and completely covered. A transliteration of baptizo is baptism. Now you see how that this word in English resembles this word in Greek. Not only looks like it, but it sounds like it. But it does not translate the word or give the meaning. Here's another word in the scriptures. I'm only going to use 3 examples. One is angelos. Here you have the, I didn't mean to do that. Here you have the anglicized word. This is the Greek word. Anytime that this is in the Greek, it should be translated messenger. And then if this were true in the New Testament, the word angel would not appear, because these were messengers of God. Now, when we look at what the transliteration is, we see angel and angelos little sounding on the same, looks a little bit like the same. Then we have diakonos. This is the word that's used in Romans 16:1, which applies to Phoebe. There's the Greek word that's beside it. That triangle in there is the D in Greek, diakonos. If it is always translated properly, it is translated servant. But we have transliterated it into deacon, which sounds very much like diakonos, very similar, and even looks a little bit like it, or the term deaconess, which is simply a feminine form of the word. Incidentally, the word that is used in Romans 16:1 is a masculine sense, meaning servant, which is neither male nor female. Okay, if proper and consistent translation had ever been used, the word, I didn't do that. Am I hearing things? Okay. The words baptism, angel, and deacon would not appear in any English translation of the New Testament scriptures. The only reason that they do is that whoever translated that particular passage says, this looks good and I'm going to do it this way, and did not give the meaning of that particular Greek word. In a paper named Supplemental Material Statement on Women in Worship and Ministry, issued by the Fourth Avenue Church of Christ in Franklin, Tennessee, with no date that's given, this particular paper had come to my attention. It was kind of interesting to me because after I read it over, I found some interesting things in it. And this is a statement that comes directly from this paper. When it comes to the role of women in the faith, there will always be differing opinions and room for discussion. This church, the Fourth Avenue Church, has studied and prayed about this subject for nearly a decade and believe the Spirit has led us to a place where our sisters can join their brothers in public roles such as prayer and facilitating communion, and leadership roles such as teaching and leading ministries. That's their privilege. That's their congregation. This continues on, and another paragraph that's there says, here would be a good place to note that the phrase over a man in verse 12 also means over her husband. It is the translator's choice to not, man, how many misspellings did I get into? I'm going to quit using David's computer. It is the translator's choice on not to bring the Greek phrase into English. This is an example of them making a choice that causes dissonance and conflict with other verses, for Paul frequently speaks of women holding high positions in the church. Where they got this high positions, I don't know, but they use this comment. We know that Priscilla is mentioned predominantly by Paul and described as an active, effective teacher in the early church. We know that Paul spoke of women praying and prophesying in 1 Corinthians 11 and 14, and said that Junia, a female name, was chief among the apostles. Some translators prefer highly esteemed among the apostles. Some have even indicated or tried to go to the position of saying that Junia was an apostle. The scripture does not say that. From a book that I have in my library that I've had for many years, this is Zondervan's The New Testament from 26 translations. What it does, takes the New Testament, compares 26 different translations of how that they either agree or disagree on any verse that's found in the New Testament. And there's only one that out of 26 that actually says and tries to take a position that Junia or Junius, in which translation that you're using, was an apostle of any kind. It simply means that she was noted and highly known by the apostles themselves. He addresses women by name and treats them as fellow workers and fellow laborers with him in Acts 16. This is the Fourth Avenue paper. I'm going to note my observation of the previous statements by those at Fourth Avenue. I don't have any contention with them. They can do what they want to. I used to work for the Fourth Avenue Church as missionary a great number of years ago. And from that particular time to where they are today has been a tremendous change in that congregation. From Zondervan Publishing House's The New Testament from 26 translations, a side-by-side comparison of that many translations on each verse of the New Testament. On Romans 16:1, the only versions that do not translate diakonos other than servant and not as deacon or deaconess are Moffat and Williams. 24 translations use this word servant and not as deaconess. Moffat says a ministering servant. This is pretty close, but not quite exactly the same thing. And Williams calls her a deaconess. All other 24 versions agree that the word should be servant. I also offer this position about commentaries and statements other than direct quote from the Scriptures. Many translations are done by individuals and reflect their own personal views of what they believe and are not necessarily consistent with the general translation of the Koine Greek. Many of the more modern translations reflect the views of the current day and time rather than being consistent with what the Greek actually says. Statements from churches fall into one or both of these areas. We are not bound by what another congregation does or says, and our obligation is to be as close to what the original texts say and not to what we think that they are trying to say. We often try to make the men in Acts 6 deacons when the Scripture says no such thing. They were just appointed to look after the needs of the Grecian widows. They may have been deacons, but we are not told that. So we need to be careful of what we say. We have to be careful that we do not fall into the trap of what the world around us is doing, specifically the religious world. For often the world wants to modernize the church, its function, and what it stands for in the eyes of those that are not following what the Bible says. And they want to dictate to the church of what the church ought to say and ought to be. Paul said it this way in 1 Peter 5:8, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil as a roaring lion walks about seeking whom he can devour. Whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world." As far as appointing women as deaconesses in the church of today, I suggest that we'd be treading on shaky ground. Without a solid example nor a specific command that we do so, we best leave the subject alone. 1 Corinthians 11:16 says, "But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God." It's not a matter to be argued about, as far as my position. Our next lesson is going to be chapter 19, Simple Trusting Faith. Got time for maybe one or two questions? No questions? Good, you're dismissed. I was going to turn them over to Johnny anyway. Thank you for being such giving me rapt attention this evening.